Thank you very much for that. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm noticing several familiar names, at least in the participant pool. So I would like to, encourage chat and discussion as we go. It doesn't need to be quite so formal. I feel like this is going to be a topic that many of us have either personal or professional experiences related to. And as this slide indicates, I'm the presenter, although the second author on this particular piece of research. Allison Crow is the department chair at East Carolina University and has a thread of research related to stigma. Dr. Patrick Mullen is from the College of William and Mary. He was our statistician, and I'm going to beg off many of the stats questions that you guys might have and say I'll come back to those if you have questions related to the stats in this particular research. And this is my first research conference with Walden, and so if you have questions or suggestions, I'm happy and open to attend to those as we move forward. Can we progress slides? Perfect, that worked nice, thank you. All right, so related to a few pieces of our previous literature, I think I'd like to start with just kind of how I have had a professional and personal kind of relationship with this topic in general. I recall when I was early in my counseling program, even as a student, I was working part-time as a front desk clerk at a mental health clinic. And I noticed one of the social workers at a community function, it was a parade, and she was just talking freely about things and using disparaging remarks about the clients that she was working with. And I couldn't help but wonder, if there was a client somewhere nearby, somebody who was hearing her saying these disparaging remarks, many of which I think all of us would agree would have a negative impact on both those clients. And then also to hear a professional in the world saying, the words she was using were things like crazy or Fruit Loop, things like that. And granted, that's been a long time ago, but still, I can't help but wonder and hold up this book that's called Crazy Like Us, which relates to how America has created a mental health kind of systemic shift all across the world. It's actually called the globalization of the American psyche. And that's the title of our book. And so, the words and vernacular that we use is something that has kind of spurred me to be curious about how professionals bracket our own personal beliefs, both as we talk with our family members and in practice settings with our clients, just making sure that we're cautious with our words, because those words can demonstrate that we have an internalized stereotype or an internalized stigma. So all of that to say, mental health literacy is an awareness of what mental health treatment and assessment, how mental health looks in a variety of settings, and really can just be summarized into a word called familiarity. And this is related to an article by Chen, Evans, and Lacko, who have been studying mental health more and more, trying to discern the impact of mental health literacy on stigma. And in fact, Chen, and I'm looking at notes, I apologize, I'm looking down because there are certain things that I just want to be very specific about. Chen found in 2018 that mental health literacy, even more so than stigma, predicted attitudes about seeking help. So if you're familiar with mental health, then you're more likely to help seek, whereas if you're not familiar, that might really inhibit your ability to seek help. We talk about stress, and stress as professionals, because professional counselors were our population, and an increased feeling of stress might lead us to seek help, or it might actually inhibit help seeking, and that's related to stigma. So if we feel like we're stressed, we might seek help because we have literacy and we might know that there is support out there for us. Conversely, we might inhibit our help seeking because we might indicate an internalized stigma saying we can't, as helpers, need help. That would demonstrate that we're weak in some way, that internalized attitude of what mental health and mental illness actually could look like. And then related to satisfaction from literature, again, Dr. Crow with her long-standing theme of literature has noted in several different populations that an increase in stigma related to help seeking leads and is positively correlated to stress and decreased satisfaction. And I imagine that makes sense to many of us in that if we have more stigma, we're less likely to look for help. We're going to feel more distress, and we're going to feel less satisfied with our life as professional counselors. So if there are no questions about that slide, thank you very much. So again, noticing the participant list, many of us are probably professional counselors, and if you're not, feel free to hop in and say, clarify more. But what I want to just briefly talk about is the impact of stigma on help seeking. And as you can imagine, there's a fear of judgment, a fear of, and a real discrimination based on having a mental health diagnosis, and then stereotyping. And all of those things lead to a real hindrance in help seeking behaviors. And so there's two sides of this. There's the public stigma, which are things that are attitudes that are portrayed in media, social media, friends, family, all of those different places where we hear messages from outside of us. And what those messages often do are perpetuate fears that those with mental illness are dangerous, are unpredictable, and or maybe blaming that mental illness for actions that have hurt others. So there are also stereotypes of what larger cultures might see as those managing mental health issues, what the treatment looks like. Could it be hospitalization in a psychiatric ward? Could it look like prison even? And then what does life look like with a mental health diagnosis? Many people imagine that, and I see this often in my clinical practice, that we want to avoid the diagnosis of a bipolar disorder because our life will never look the same again. Whereas there might be, an opportunity for proper medication, proper support, proper services, that we as individuals who have mental health literacy see in a different perspective. So that's kind of a public stigma from a negative perspective. And what happens is if we hear those messages over and over again, we take those to be internalized. And so what happens is we might start to feel like we have symptoms of depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder. We might start to notice that. And because of those messages about how we are not valuable anymore because of the public stigma, that we're dangerous, that we're unpredictable, we start to feel shame and we start to self-loathe. And what happens is that can become a cycle. And that particular cycle where it prevents us from help seeking, it prevents us from feeling comfortable in ourselves, can actually be more harmful to the individual than that particular illness itself. So I'd like to move forward to the next slide. And so I think it's Dr. Crow, her first name is Allison, so I'm going to call her Allison. So Allison has a previous research study related to the same question within school counselors. And so when school counselors were exposed to public stigma, they had a decrease in their satisfaction of work because not only are they trying to do work with sometimes challenging clients, but they're also trying to address the larger systemic issues. And so also it was noticed that school counselors had internalized stigma. And what that means is that they're less satisfied in their work because they're trying to navigate an internal dissonance. They're trying to say, I want you to feel better. I want you to heal in a way and be well. But at the same time, there's that internalized ideal that's just really difficult to shake about, well, maybe you are dangerous or maybe you are unpredictable. And so kind of what that looks like in practice is something that has had a larger and growing body of literature. Thank you. All right, so again, if you have any questions or want to know more about particular topics, feel free to put those in the chat section. So we have two research questions. The first and the second are similar. So I'm just gonna read the first and then kind of ditto for the second because they're wordy. So the first is, do mental health literacy, self-stigma of mental illness, and attitudes towards professional help seeking predict practicing counselors' perceived stress? And so as a group of variables, do those things impact stress or perceived stress in counselors who have been practicing? And the second research question is all of those variables related to perceived life satisfaction. And so we're grounded in a model for mental health help seeking, which includes three main domains: recognizing that mental health is a problem, deciding to seek help, and then selecting a service. So that is our theoretical grounding. We can move forward. Great, thank you. All right, so our methods, and again, I'm just gonna make sure I'm not missing anything in my notes before we move on. Okay, perfect. All right, so our methods. We had a total participant pool of 145 professional counselors, and those professional counselors were mostly from the Southeast. And I will talk more about pooling. The mean age is 43 and a half, right? And so the standard deviation demonstrates that there's a wide variance. You'll see that many of our participants were female, which is on par for the professional counseling profession. And then years of experience, we have about 8.5 years of experience. And so if you look at the age and years of experience, that's a pretty standard experience. So these are not necessarily new counselors. These are counselors who have had some years of practice. You'll notice that our N of 84 for our white participants, 26, 24, and it continues to break down. So the majority of our professional counselors were self-identified as white, which again is consistent with the professional counseling, the counseling profession, let me say it like that, the counseling profession as a whole. Although that's shifting and changing, many of our participants were identifying as white female. Excellent. Okay, so again, years of experience as a counselor, we have 8.6 years, which again is pretty decent. So we're not dealing with novice, we're not dealing with those who are about to retire. And then just a variance of settings. We have mental health agencies, private practice, school settings. You'll notice that school substance abuse settings are about the same, and then college counseling and then crisis counseling also had the same N. So we have a variety of different places in which these professional counselors were drawn from. All right, so we had several different measures actually. We had a perceived stress scale, which is 10 items and asks about your experience within the last 30 days. So I'm happy to read a couple of samples just to give you an idea of what a perceived stress scale might look like. And specifically, it might read like, in the last month, how often have you felt nervous or stressed? And so the range would be from 0 to, which means never, or 4, very often. And then the scores were just calculated by summing those totals, and there were some reversed coded. All right, so we have our satisfaction with life scale is 5 items, and it's again a Likert type scale, 1 to 7. Conditions, I am satisfied with my life would be a sample item, or if I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing. And questions related to that would just demonstrate that I'm satisfied with my life to date. Self-stigma of mental illness scale, again, another 10 question item, and a sample would be, I would feel inadequate if I had a mental illness. And so to ask a professional counselor that might really indicate how they feel about mental illness. We can move forward, please. All right, so then we have attitudes towards mental health treatment. And so a sample question for this would be, I feel confident that I could find a therapist who is understanding and respectful of my ethnicity and culture. So that demonstrates that we have a familiarity with and comfort with mental health treatment. And then finally, we have the max, which is 12 items. And a sample item would include if I had if a friend had a mental health, oh golly, my pages are out of order. Hang on. If my friend had a mental health problem, I know what advice to give them to get professional help. So do we have a knowledge of assessment, treatment, and ability to access mental health? We can move forward, please. Thank you. All right, so again, I'm going to beg off many of the statistical questions if you have any, but there were correlations, there were linear multiple regressions. There's no missing data of the 145 participants who completed this. They completed it fully. And there were 3 cases in which we had outliers. And so I don't know how to say that word, Mahalanobus. If there's a participant here who can say that, that would be great. But I do know what it means. So what it means is that it is a general observed stance of variance from the mean. And so if you're looking at a cluster of scores, we might look at those 3 particular individual cases to see how far they are from the rest of the group. We can move forward. Thank you. All right, so research question 1. We did have a significant result. And so what this means is that, sorry, I'm flipping and plopping all over the place because I want to make sure I say this correctly. What we know is that the 3 variables from our first research question, mental health literacy, self-stigma, and attitudes, did predict variance in perceived stress, right? And so we know that if we manipulate any of those three things or all of those three things, it will demonstrate a shift in perceived stress. Particularly under the standardized regression coefficients, we indicate that self-stigma and attitudes are significant predictors of stress. And so that makes sense intuitively to me that if I feel like the client who's sitting across from me might be dangerous or unpredictable, as demonstrated in those earlier slides, that it might make me more stressed, right? I might feel unsafe in my clinical practice. I might feel unsafe in all of these other ways, which might lead me to feel more stressed. But what was surprising to me is that mental health literacy was not a significant predictor of stress. And so being aware that there are providers out there to support clients, that doesn't help me feel less stressed, which to me it seems like it should, but that's what our findings say. The best predictors, self-stigma with a correlation of 81%, attitudes with a correlation of 80%, and then mental health literacy, like really not at all, 7% correlation between mental health literacy and perceived stress. Move forward, please. Thank you. All right, so here is our table, and you can see our p-values of 0.001 are the ones that have significance. And then I'll just give you a moment to kind of look that over and ask any questions. Okay, I suppose we can move forward in that also. Thank you very much. All right, so research question 2 had pretty stable outcomes compared to research question 1. So again, if you remember, we have those 3 different variables. We have mental health literacy, we have internalized stigma, and attitudes towards professional help seeking. Those 3 predictor variables combined can predict 13% of our variance in our life satisfaction. Again, we used a standardized regression coefficient, and what did come back as significant were attitudes towards help-seeking behaviors and self-stigma of mental illness. Again, mental health literacy was not a significant predictor of life satisfaction. And, in this way, again, just talking kind of intuitively, if I'm feeling stressed and not necessarily satisfied, mental health literacy should be correlated probably at the same rate as both of these things. And so if you look at the best predictors, self-stigma has a 71% correlation with a higher life satisfaction. I'm sorry, it's negative, so a reverse correlation. Attitudes, the less comfortable I am with referring you for mental health counseling, the less likely I am to be satisfied with my life. And then mental health literacy is really not, it is a predictor, but it is the least predictive of these particular things. And you'll see 0.27 is really not a standout correlation between mental health literacy and life satisfaction. Thank you. All right, so this is my favorite section. And again, I would like to include, I'm reading, thank you. I see your question, Bill, and I will read it more thoroughly in just a second. My favorite part of any sort of research is the discussions and the implications. And the discussion of this particular research demonstrates that higher levels of stigma are predictive of stress and lower life satisfaction. And again, to me, that kind of makes intuitive sense. And, I wish I could see you in a more face-to-face format so that we could have this discussion. Because I would imagine you have a similar belief system that if you have an internalized stigma or belief system that is just outside of your realm of awareness, that it would be really hard to connect with a client who you have some sort of that dissonance related to. Again, negative attitudes towards professional help seeking, it's really related to stigma. And so if we're talking about not feeling comfortable with help seeking in general, how does that match with me being a professional counselor? That would create stress and lower life satisfaction, intuitively. And so the results of this particular study helped make sense of my own awareness of those counselors who are burned out, or those counselors who really just don't have the same qualities as what I would imagine from the core competencies from an ACA perspective. This research demonstrated that those things are true. If there's any sort of concern about a client from a stigmatic stigmatized perspective, we're going to have a hard time connecting with the people who are in most need of our support. So what the surprise was is that mental health literacy does not impact our stress or predict life satisfaction. And so I'd love to hear some ideas about maybe why that could be. And in the implication section, which is our next slide, I've written a few, and these are of course just, from a manuscript submission perspective, just the ones that kind of are the highlights. And so to me, it seems that, first of all, I'm not surprised that professional counselors hold internalized stigmas. It seems like it would be almost impossible to avoid that. But the way in which we approach the knowledge of having research that continues to follow up and demonstrate that more and more professional counselors, no matter where you work, are holding on to this stigma, whether again, it's inside of your conscious awareness or not. But what this means is that if we're feeling stressed or we're feeling burned out, maybe we could take a look at our lived experience. And if we address that stigma, maybe we could feel more satisfied and maybe we could experience less stress, and how that impacts the therapeutic relationship. Again, if you are feeling that the client sitting across from you, whether it is a child in a school counseling setting or someone dealing with anger management issues, if you have a stigma against them, then it is very difficult to have those major core conditions that we all know facilitate a therapeutic relationship. And from a supervisor perspective, just to be aware of this, that we can know that many of us hold internalized stigma against those who we serve. And then also, as counselor educators, we know that the knowledge that we're facilitating doesn't directly impact stress or satisfaction. And so to find other creative ways to promote that stress, that decreased stress, and to increase that life satisfaction, because by imparting knowledge and sharing data and details, it's not going to make the change that we necessarily might want. So we might engage in classroom dialogue regarding the awareness of having a stigma. I know that in my classrooms, many of the students who I teach, when I say, maybe you should go and feel what it feels like to be a client, you can almost see it on their face, like that is a vulnerable space to be in. And so that, to me, that facial just kind of thought demonstrates that there is something there, and that might be stigma. That might be that internalized stigma that we're experiencing. We can move forward, please. Okay, so as supervisors, if we are holding this internalized stigma, which we can assume it's in there somewhere, it might impact our supervisory relationship, especially because a growing population of mental health counselors are coming into this field because they have a family history or personal history with mental health. And so how we look at both our supervisees and also the clients in which they work, it's a trickle-down effect. We know that that's a systemic cycle that we're going through. And so just to be aware of that and attend to personal attitudes, right? And then again, as counselor educators, oh, that's a repeat. I don't need to say anything because that's a repetitive slide. Can we move forward, please? Excellent, thank you. All right, so we have some limitations and future directions. I would like to be very clear and honest that there were some sampling issues. And so we used two different listservs to try and capture the data that's presented to you today. Countless emails were returned undeliverable. And so what happens there is that we are not able to determine a response rate. Truly the number of emails that were either bounced back or were never responded to, it's hard to discern, where that information was lost. So if those people are not in the profession of counseling, kind of where that breakdown was. And then of course we have sampling bias. These professional counselors, of course, probably capture in some way an interest in this particular topic. And then the mental health knowledge schedule, that is measure has weak reliability. And so just to note that those particular limitations exist. So as far as future directions, what this could look like is that, for me, I am curious, if we have a history of mental illness in our family, does that impact how our attitudes, how our stigma looks, how our stress looks as we're professional counselors? I'm just curious about that, right? So I come from a space of curiosity, and that's just something that I'm interested in. And I know that mental health has a particular stigma attached to it, but substance abuse has a different stigma around it. And so I'm curious if we're managing, a subset of professional counselors who might work more focused with substance abuse. I wonder if the findings would be different. And specifically assessing and exploring cultural values. So are there differences in gender and specifically race as our profession shifts from a majority of Caucasian white professional counselors to including more minority professional counselors? How does that look? And specifically around conversations with clients of color, of minority status, and how that looks, because there are so many different generational and systems of oppression that keep that treatment gap in place. And then of course, years of experience. And so I'm curious if newer, younger counselors who have been part of anti-bullying experiences, like if their assessment, if their awareness and attitudes and that internalized stigma, if that shifts through the generations. I know that as I talk to some older counselors, that their stigma is a little bit more present, it's more palatable, but that's just my lived experience. And so I'm curious from a research perspective if that's something that would be fruitful. We can move forward, please. So that leaves us ending just on time for questions and answers.
Yeah, perfect timing. Thanks, Dr.
Yeah.
Spargo. So just a reminder, if you have questions for Dr. Spargo regarding her research or anything that she discussed, we do have about 10 minutes for questions if you'd like to type those into the chat area. And I know we had the comment from Bill Barkley as well, so I don't know if you want to take a peek at that one first.
Let me read that. All right, Bill Barkley, you were talking about stats. Looks like significant correlations among predictor variables. That's true. So, thank you, Rebecca. Yes, Dan, I can say where the research can go from here. Bill, I appreciate your insight into the regression equation. I will note that and see, take a look at the data and see if I can find anything on that particular avenue. Give me just a second while I write that question down. Or is that something that can be written down and emailed to me? Yeah,
Yep, I was
that's great.
just going to tell you, I can get it for you.
Perfect. Okay. So to respond to the question about where this research could go from here, truly, I think, I'm a practitioner and an educator. And so to have a conversation with students as they're matriculating through their coursework and saying, learning this information is insufficient to making lifelong changes about your stress that you're going to experience as a professional counselor. There has to be going forward more into it about how this as a career is uplifting to us as professionals. And so just kind of keeping that in mind as a supervisor and a counselor educator and as a counselor. If you start to feel burned out, you might be starting to experience, sorry, changing my video. There we go. You might be starting to experience the effects of being inundated by the world. I mean, just turning on the TV, it's hard not to see that really anytime that there is an act of tremendous violence, that there is an initial question of mental health. So I think that moving it forward in very tangible and real ways would be one of the things that I would like to take forward with it. And then just continuing to establish this line of research to show that, even as mental health practitioners, we have these biases, and trying to figure out ways or mediating variables that might impact that would be some of the ways that I would imagine it. But of course, the wonderful thing about sharing research is to open up that dialogue. So I'd be curious, where you as participants of this presentation might see this moving forward.
Okay, and while we give you guys just a moment to ponder that, I will just mention that as we wrap up today's session, you do have a bit of a break after this one. So you can go grab lunch, go stretch your legs a little bit, and the research conference will be picking up with the third and fourth plenary speakers at 2 p.m. Eastern. And it looks like we've got a couple comments coming through for you, Dr. Spargo.
Thank you. I see
Yep.
Uju. Thank you. Yeah, the other stigma. That is a good question. That would be curious. I'm writing that one down too. Future directions, friends.
That's great.
Absolutely. I appreciate that too, especially from COVID. You're right. And how that fits into counselor self-care, right? So I was talking to a class, pre-prac over the weekend about how my work as a professional counselor is truly like, I see that as self-care. I love working with my clients and aligning myself with them as they achieve their goals. And so just managing that. But, others say that you need self-care from your profession. And if you need self-care from your profession, I'd like to know more about that. So, I appreciate that. Thanks, Carol, for your thumbs up.
Okay, well, that's great. We appreciate the questions coming in. And oh, and look, we've got a couple more here.
All right. Yes. Okay. So that is a great question. So I think I mentioned in the beginning, Chen has a growing body of literature that demonstrates literacy is more predictive than stigma. And interesting, his participants were, I want to say that they mostly identified with an Asian background. And so our literacy as Americans might look very different than that particular subset of a population. And so that's part of the reason that I'd be curious from a cultural perspective. And if it was as easy as just, creating education, creating literacy, then that would be fantastic because we could take that information and potentially shift it into racial stereotypes or other places in which stigma exists. And so again, I was a little bit dismayed actually that literacy wasn't as predictive in this particular study. But again, one study doesn't create truth, it just creates an avenue for more exploration. So that's a great point. Thank you.
Okay, more thank yous for your presentation, Dr. Spargo.
Thank you. Thank you.
So at this point, we will, looks like we've got all the questions, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. Again, I want to thank you, Dr. Spargo, for sharing your research with us today and being a part of the research conference, and to all of those that attended the session as well. We did record the session, and I'm told that all of the session materials and such will be available in ScholarWorks in the near future, so I'm sure you'll hear more to come on that. But thanks again, everyone, for attending, and hopefully I'll see you again at another paper presentation or plenary, as we've got quite a few more being delivered throughout the day.
Thanks again, everyone.